Hello everyone, I am Pam Grove from Preserving Life Ministries, and I've been talking with you a little bit about the biblical reasons for preserving food to preserve life. But now I want to give you a little bit of the history of food preservation and just a brief idea of why we should be doing this today. Food preservation started a long time ago. Actually, it's biblically based. Back when Abraham was leaving his family, when Jacob was leaving his family, when Joseph was going into Egypt, they were drying food. We see them carrying meal and raisins and dates along with them. And they use other different methods for doing that. There were containers that they would use, such as bags, and you read in the Bible where you shouldn't put new wine into old bags. Those bags were usually animal skin bags, and after a while they would dry rot and deteriorate and the bag would burst. So it wasn't a very effective way of preserving food, but it did work for them. Other ways that they preserved food was in root cellars, and root cellars have been popular up until the refrigerator came onto the scene, and then people didn't so much use root cellars anymore. People used methods such as drying, where food was laid out on mats or laid out on the ground or hung from trees and dried until it was crisp. And that was one method of preserving food. Curing is a method of preserving food, where they would smoke it in a smokehouse. The bad thing about that is formaldehyde and alcohol are given off when you smoke food, and those are byproducts that are not good for the human body. Other forms of food preservation included honey. Honey is one of the most interesting forms because honey is agroscopic, meaning that it's mostly sugar and absolutely no water, or very little water, if any. Honey can be kept for up to 300 years and maintain its flavor, its color, and its freshness. The other thing about honey is the ancient Egyptians used to use it to embalm bodies when they died. As a matter of fact, the Smithsonian has on its website a mummy of a gentleman that they found in Kurgan, Georgia. He was in his tomb along with his family and his servants, his wagon wheels, and they had food in there. And they were all encased or embalmed in honey. The food that they found in the tomb was fresh enough for them to cut it open and smell it, and it smelled like food. And one of them tasted it, which I wouldn't have done because they claim it's 4,000 to 5,000 years old, and it tasted like food. So we know honey has healing properties also. When you put it on a wound, the reason that it can heal your wound is because it has hydrogen peroxide. One good thing about honey also is that honey contains very little moisture, and one of the reasons that it does is because the bees are very intelligent. God gifted them with the ability to tell how much moisture to take out of the honey for it to be shelf stable. So when the bees go into the hive and put in the honey, they check it for moisture content before they cap it off. And if the moisture content is too high, worker bees come in and flap their wings and circulate the air and dry out the honey. So that was one method of preservation. The bees help us preserve honey for longevity, and honey helps preserve us for longevity. That's a blessing. Another method is sugar curing. Sugar curing is where you would take a jar and put the fruit in it that you would want to preserve, and then you fill the jar with sugar. And what happens is the sugar draws the moisture out of the food into itself, and the food begins to dry out. Without moisture in the food, bacteria can't grow, and the food is preserved. Salt works in pretty much the same manner. When you put food in salt to cure it, the salt draws out the water, and the food dries up, and it's preserved. These are some of the ancient ways of preserving food. Well, food preservation has come a long way since then. During the 1700s, women began to can food at home, and they had crude methods of doing that. One of them was they would use this bottle that had a belly shape to it and a skinny neck, and they would cork it with a corn cob, and that's what sealed the jar. Another method that they used was called egg wash. They would take egg whites and whip them up, and then they would take parchment paper and dip it into the egg white and stretch it over the top of the jar. They would tie a string around the neck and leave it to dry. It would dry as tight as a drum and keep their food preserved. Now, it didn't last very long, But it was a method of preservation that God winked at because they were doing the best that they could. Now we're moving up to the 1800s, where times began to change and methods began to change. And most of it is because of a man named Nicholas Appert. Nicholas was a Frenchman. His father was an innkeeper, and Nicholas was a confectioner. He loved to play with food all of his life. And that's what he would do. He would experiment with food items. Well, while he was young, the French Revolution began, and France was at war with England. The Navy and the Army were starving to death. More of them were dying because of starvation than were dying because of the war. And Napoleon put out a notice that anyone who could prepare a method of preserving food so that he could save the troops would be given 12,000 francs. Well, Nicholas took that challenge. And for the next 14 years, he worked scientifically to perfect the methods that he had been working on previously of preserving food. He had already learned how to preserve beer, but now he wanted to learn how to preserve food. He set up a laboratory for himself, and he planted a garden, and he picked the food fresh from the garden and took it to the laboratory and bottled it. He wrote down all of his methods and all of the equipment that he used and the time factors that he used. And in 14 years, his food was presented to the Navy and they accepted it. They took the information on to Napoleon, who awarded him the 12,000 francs. Nicholas was the first person to invent a pressure cooker, and they called it an autoclave. In that is where he cooked his food and prepared it. He also opened a store and wrote a cookbook. We get our pressure canning methods from this gentleman. Now, as we move on in the 1800s, the Ball brothers come in, who make Ball canning jars. The Mason brothers come in, who created canning jars also. They were tinsmiths at one time, and they switched to making jars. All of these people contributed to the methods that we use for canning today. Now we're going to move forward to why this is important. Home canning was one of the primary ways of canning in the 1940s during World Wars I and II. And the reason that is important is because our government did not want to have to ration food. So they encouraged the citizens to become involved in the war effort by planting victory gardens. When they planted these gardens, part of the produce from these gardens would go back into the war efforts to feed the soldiers, and part of it would feed the families. But one chief thing that the government did during this time, because aluminum was being rationed so that they could make weapons of war, canners were not being produced anymore. So the government encouraged the citizens that owned canners to share them with their neighbors, to come together and work together and can that produce. For those who didn't have canners in their neighborhoods, the government set up canning centers where they would send in employees, government employees, to train the people in the community and their children how to preserve food. Preserving food really does preserve life. After that, after World Wars I and II, when they were completed, victory gardens disappeared. Our government didn't sponsor them anymore, and people didn't feel a need for them anymore. So in the 1950s to the 1970s, we find that grocery stores, fast food restaurants, and migration out of the country farm into the suburbs changed the way America saw food. No longer do we eat in our kitchens. No longer do we prepare our foods at home. Now we go out to eat. And so now we've become more dependent on our society for what we eat. But there are consequences for that. We're becoming sicker and sicker, and now our children are being born with illnesses that we've never seen in children before. Why is that important? What do we understand changed to cause these things to happen? Well, one of the changes is the way our food is grown. We know now that we have seeds that are genetically modified, that are not true to their strain, so we don't exactly know what we're eating. The genes are mixed with other things, sometimes with human genetic material. We know that colorants and additives and sweeteners and all kinds of other things are added to the food products today that we've never had before. And some of these things are untested. One of the most interesting things that is happening to food today that I have studied is irradiation. And I'm going to make this explanation short so that you understand it. Irradiation is like X-rays to the food. 1 RAD is a measurement of irradiation. So 1 RAD is equal to 1 human X-ray. So say you go out and you have a chest X-ray. You would have 1 RAD. Well, meat products in the United States are irradiated at a rate of 8 RAD. That's 8,000 chest X-rays. But did you know that herbs and spices are irradiated at a rate of 30 RAD, which is 3 million chest X-rays? Now you say, why would herbs and spices be irradiated at such a high rate, and they're so tender and so small, and meat, which is dense and thick, be irradiated at a fraction of that RAD? Well, if you really think about that, herbs and spices are the medicine that God gave us to heal the diseases that we have. So if you irradiate them at a very high rate, you completely destroy them. Other things that are being irradiated are lettuce, fresh fruits, fresh vegetables, crustaceans. If you go online to the U.S. government website and put a query in for irradiated foods, the list comes up. And you will see that the things on the list that are getting the most irradiation are the fresh foods, the things that we as vegetarians eat, the things that most of Americans enjoy. I want you to do your research, because I found online a U.S. congressional hearing where 4 medical doctors, 4 scientists did research on irradiation and found that irradiation causes cancer. One of these doctors is a cancer specialist, an oncologist, and he states in the congressional hearing that he will not eat irradiated foods. There is a symbol on the foods that are irradiated. And if you want that information, you can go to our website, www.preservinglifeministries.org. We have that symbol on our website. I want you to take a look at it, because when you see that symbol on foods in your grocery store, I want you to really think about whether or not you want to purchase that for your family. Now, I'm saying all of that to say this. I keep talking about the time of trouble because I love the Lord, and I want to warn you because I want you to be ready, just as I want myself and my family to be ready. One of the things that is killing us as a people is appetite. This is a sin that started in Eden, but it's continuing on. And a lot of us feel like we can't give up the things that we love. We love potato chips. We love ice cream. We love cookies. But all of these things have additives and preservatives and colorants in them that are killing us. We may not die today, but over time, we are genetically dying. We're passing these poisons and toxins on through our DNA to our children. One of the facts I found out about irradiation is that some of the herbs and spices that are irradiated will absorb the radiation. And when we consume them, that puts radiation into our bodies. When that goes into our bodies, it doesn't just go away. We have children and we pass these defective genes on to them. Please think about what you're eating. Do your own research. Don't take my word for it. Go online and do a study as to what is happening to our food. Those are not the only things that are happening in our society. Our air is polluted. Our water is polluted. You know, we think about the toxins in our home, in our clothing, because they're dyed, in our sheets, in the laundry detergent we use every day. We want to preserve our lives, saints, because we need clear minds in the last days to be able to discern good from evil. We want to be able to make the right choices, and we want to be able to lead others to Christ. Do everything you can to preserve your life. Part of that is preserving your own food. You know, we should be shopping from our own cupboards. We should be drying. We should be canning. We should be dehydrating or freeze drying or freezing by whatever method you find best for your family. Choose 2 or 3 of those methods and put away your own food. And when you need something to eat, Open your cupboard and make it yourself. Adam and Eve didn't have Walmart, but they ate very well. And had they not sinned, they would have eaten to eternal life. That's what we want to do. We want to return to Eden, return to what's natural, return to those things that God has given us so that we are eating, we're preserving food, and we're preserving life. May God bless you and keep you, and may you keep marching on until He comes again.